Welcome to our webinar on race nutrition. So this is an important webinar because I think that it's very difficult to overthink nutrition because it's a complex thing. Um, but we're going to try to break it down today, and to make it simple, I always like to break it down into three main categories, and that's fluid, carbohydrates, and sodium, because those are the three things that you really lose when you exercise, especially in hot conditions, especially when you're racing and putting out a higher intensity level. But if we want to break it down further, when we're racing, what we're really trying to do is, especially if we're racing long course, is sort of preserve as long as possible our glycogen stores, which are the stored carbohydrates in our body, and we want to maintain basically blood plasma volume. So that's the fluid in our blood that's important for so that you do not obviously dehydrate, and you don't want your blood to turn to syrup because you end up having to work harder. But when we're sweating, that's mainly what we're sweating out, that plasma from the blood, and in that plasma there is a lot of sodium. So we want to discuss today how to think about replacing or replenishing fluid, carbs, and sodium, and kind of clarify, depending on the race that we are competing in, how we have to think about nutrition. And we'll also talk about training, different, should nutrition during training be different than when you're racing? And we'll also talk about carbohydrate loading and even sodium loading before the race. I know Alex is on this call, and she is the master as it relates to consuming basically carbohydrate loading. But let's just start the discussion on and focus on fluid. So hydration and humans' perspective on it has evolved sort of through the 20th century, and even in the 21st century. It used to be thought that you should not drink anything. And so we think about the old-timey marathons, in the 1896 Olympics or something, or even through, like the 50s, it was thought that you should not drink anything. And then Tim Noakes in kind of like the 80s and 90s, he thought, oh, you should drink to thirst, essentially. But our understanding has evolved, and the issue of drinking to thirst is that you leave some performance on the table there, because we now know that you lose fluid and sodium faster than your thirst sensors can be aware of, and we know that replacing at a higher rate will enhance performance. So now in 2023, we know that hydrating is very, very important. And the question is, well, how much should I be drinking during a race? And the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on your sweat rate. It depends on the duration of the event, because obviously a shorter event, you might not need to take in anything because you're just not going to dehydrate all that much. Whereas a longer event like an Ironman, I mean, it is absolutely essential to dial in your hydration and rehearse your nutrition strategy and training. And this is one thing I'm going to bring up a lot. You have to practice this, especially during the race specific workouts. They usually, for long course athletes, they usually happen on the weekends, and you cannot neglect the opportunities that you have to test all this, because A, you need to figure out what you can tolerate, and B, if you're not tolerating enough, you can actually train your gut to potentially absorb more carbohydrates, more fluid, etc. But first, what we want to talk about is, at what level of dehydration does performance decay? And It really depends athlete to athlete. As a rule of thumb, if you lose more than 2 to 4% of your body weight, you're going to see a performance impairment. But it depends on a lot of things. I know in 2009 in the Dubai Marathon, Haile Gabriel Selassie, when he ran a 2:05 marathon, which back then was very fast. Now everybody's doing it, but he lost 10% of his body weight. And he was a little guy to start with, like 120 pounds, but and he was fine. So he's in the category of somebody who could tolerate that. But the other thing to consider is he probably towed the line weighing maybe 3 or 4 pounds more than he does during, say, a normal training day. So because if we load up quickly or well on carbs and salt and fluid before the race, we might toe the line, a couple kilograms heavier, and that's a good thing. We always say, you want to toe the line puffy in an Ironman race or a 70.3 so that you're storing all that extra fluid and carbohydrates. So, but as a rule, once you're above 4%, most athletes are going to see a decay in performance. So if we do the math over an Ironman, you need to know your sweat rate. You need a drink so that you do not lose more than 2 to 4%. That's ideal. And what does this mean? It means that most athletes need to be targeting about 750 to 1500 milliliters per hour. That's 26 to kind of 32 ounces per hour. That's the range most athletes fall in, and most athletes can absorb that. I'll say most athletes can absorb 750 to 1000 milliliters. So about a liter, call it 26 to 32 ounces. Above that, it kind of depends on the athlete. Usually bigger athletes can consume a little bit more. Smaller athletes, they're going to probably be sweating a little bit less. But this is the ballpark. It's kind of the starting point. And you need to test this in training, and you need to test it in a variety of conditions also. On a cool day, if you're not sweating, your body might not want to kind of take in as much as on a hot day. And if you're training in hot conditions, or you're in Kona or something, you're going to be sweating more than if you're in the middle of winter, riding outside or riding in an air-conditioned pain cave. And one really important factor that I think a lot of athletes miss is bottle size. So when I speak in terms of liters, I think I know a lot of athletes have interpreted that in the past as meaning a bike bottle, but it's not. Most bike bottles are in the kind of 600 to 750 milliliter range. So when I'm talking about liters, I'm talking about 32 ounces. And there are liter-sized bike bottles that I would recommend getting. Zafal Magnum bottles are good. The green Gatorade bottles are good. I know Precision Hydration, they make liter bottles. So those are nice because it makes doing the math easy, and you can just carry more. Does anybody have any questions or comments on fluid or anything we talked about so far?
Just one comment about the Gatorade bottles is that they can sometimes not work with the gorilla cages. They're a bit too large, so just test out the water bottle to make sure that they work with the cages that you have and where you want to put them.
That's a good point. And I know the more expensive ones come with the gator skin, which is like a sort of like a soft, grippy material. Those don't work in the gorilla cages. You cannot get those in. So I usually rip those off, so that it's just the pure plastic. Get the cheap one. And then the next thing that we should think about, carbohydrates. So, why are carbohydrates important? Well, they're the preferred source of fuel when we are going hard. And our body has a finite supply of carbohydrates, unlike fat, where you have tens of thousands of calories of fat to burn. With carbohydrates, your body might only store 300 or 400 grams of carbs as glycogen. Call it 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth. And if you're working at a high intensity, you're burning quite a bit. You might be burning at threshold. You might be burning as much as 200 grams or more per hour. At Ironman pace, it depends on the Ironman pace, but you can easily be burning, 90 to 150 grams per hour. So you need to replace a lot of the carbohydrates you're losing, or else you're going to bonk. And when we bonk, what that means is your glycolytic system, metabolism basically doesn't work. Your body doesn't have access to carbohydrates. So it will only rely on fat. And that means you're going to be going pretty darn slowly. So we need to replace carbohydrates in long races. And there's also evidence that taking in carbohydrates in shorter races can enhance performance. There's this glucose mouth rinse phenomenon in short time trials. Even if you just rinse your mouth out with some glucose, like a glucose solution, it will enhance performance by a fair amount. Our brains are weird, so it's pretty powerful stuff. And when we think about consuming carbohydrates, an obvious question is, well, how many grams of carbohydrates should I consume per hour? And the answer is it depends. The textbook answer is 60 to 90 grams of carbs is somewhat kind of the old school answer. And know that a gram of carbohydrates, there's 4 calories in a gram. So we're talking about 240 to 360 calories worth of carbohydrates per hour. It's a reasonable target for a lot of athletes, but we're finding that pushing the limits there in training and racing has some benefits, specifically when it comes to recovery. You can recover faster and get back at it sooner if you make sure that you're replacing a lot of the carbohydrates you're burning during key endurance sessions. But carb max is commonly thought of as 90 grams of carbs. And most athletes should be able to absorb 90 grams of carbs per hour over, a multiple hour race or training day. So long as there's a good ratio of glucose to fructose. Most sports drinks or gels that you find, the ratio is about 2-to-1 glucose to fructose. So there are 2 types of basically sugar molecules, 2 different carbohydrate molecules. And because if you take in glucose and fructose, you can absorb about 30 to 40% more because the transport of molecules in the gut are different. So look for sports drinks or gels that have both of these. Almost any high-end performance-focused hydration company is going to have both of these types, but 2-to-1 is pretty common a lot. And now we're seeing more 1-to-1 ratios for a lot of athletes. A 1-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose is actually better. So, consider that. But again, 90 grams it's a good, I wouldn't say starting point. Starting point might be 70 to 80, try that. But most athletes who I work with can tolerate 90 grams of carbs per hour during an Ironman without experiencing gut bombs. But you might need to train up to that. I don't know if Dallin is on this call, but he famously took in about 150 grams of carbs per hour on a lot of training days and at Ironman Maryland. And he crushed the race. He did really well, no gut bomb at all. So he's an example of somebody who can take in more. And if you can take in more, it's not a bad idea to do so. But again, you need to test it in training to make sure you're not going to experience a gut bomb. One other thing I want to say about carbohydrate burn is we can test and establish how many grams of carbohydrates you're burning at a given intensity. So different ways that you could do this. You can go into a lab and they can hook you up to a metabolic cart and have you pedal at, say, Ironman pace or 70.3 pace or threshold. And in real time, assuming that, it's a good metabolic cart, they'll know how many grams of carbs you're combusting per hour. So that's a good way to do it. We have a metabolic cart here at our lab in Nashville. You can sign up through Transformation Lab. And then we can also establish this via inside testing. We can do this remotely. So I know a bunch of athletes have taken advantage of this, but you do a bunch of, we have a webinar on it too. I won't go into detail, but you do some max power intervals, and we look at them, how they relate to one another, and we know exactly how many carbs you're burning at a given wattage output. And then if you know this, then there's no guessing, and doing an Ironman is a math problem. We know, say, if you're combusting 150 grams per hour at Ironman pace, it's going to take you 10 hours to do the Ironman. It's like, okay, if you come out of the water with 300 grams of carbs in your glycogen stores, then, you know, what does the power output need to be? How many grams of carbohydrates should you take in per hour so that you finish the race at, you know, with a little bit of glycogen left? That's one of the best ways to figure out Ironman pace, honestly. And, you know, you can become more efficient at burning carbs over time. And then looping back to the actual type of fuel that we're putting into our bodies. Basically, you can think about it as sports drink, you know, like Tailwind, Gatorade, etc. And then you have the gels and the chews, which are more solid. And sports drink, you know, consuming a lot of your carbohydrates and fluids via sports drink is a solid approach. Many athletes find that separating, you know, electrolytes and fluid from their carbohydrate consumption kind of sits better in their stomach. So some athletes, they'll consume most of their calories or carbs via gels and chews. And we actually know that the rate at which your stomach absorbs sugar or carbohydrates is the same, no matter if it's you're drinking a sports drink or, you know, drinking, you know, an electrolyte drink with gels or chews, which might be surprising. But so both approaches work well. One thing I will say, whenever you're drinking during a race, you should have sodium in that fluid, unless you're getting a lot of sodium elsewhere and you're planning for it to mix in your gut. But taking fluid with sodium enhances the absorption rate. And it's also the case that if you are not taking sodium with the fluid, then you are diluting the sodium stores in your body, and that's not a good thing. Your body needs to have a lot of sodium in that in blood, or else you're going to have issues. And that's a good segue to talking about sodium, you know, a little bit. But before I move on to sodium, does anybody have any questions or comments on carbohydrates?
I'm wondering if this is a natural, wondering if this is a natural place to slot in around carb loading protocols for training, racing, and then maybe also post-workout recovery protocols. So to the point that you were sharing earlier, Conrad, glycogen, main form of glucose stored in our body. We actually have that storage in our muscles and in our liver. An average person who's consuming about 50% of carbohydrates in their diet day to day has about 80 grams of glycogen within their liver and about 300 grams of glycogen within their muscles. So right around that 350 to 400 gram mark. So again, 50% carbohydrates. So that's the diet, you know, regular diet protocol to actually ensure that. And you can actually increase that storage of glucose in one's body up to about 500 grams. So you can improve that by 120 grams, which is a pretty steep improvement, either by or a combination of increasing the day-to-day composition of your diet to be upwards of 50% of carbohydrates. And for most endurance athletes to fall within the recommended range of carbohydrate intake to really fuel performance and also bolster and support recovery, most people are going to find that their diet naturally needs to be upwards of 50% anyway to maintain their weight, to fuel their performance and maintain that power. But they can also do this through a strategic carb load protocol about 2 to 3 days before their race, which is essentially a targeted protocol where for a couple of days in lead up, you're consuming 70% or more of carbohydrates within your diet. Tends to be a focus on higher glycemic index foods. So carbohydrates that perhaps a lot of us might think as quote unquote like no carbs, things that can be very easily absorbed. So these are times when it's, add a glass of juice with breakfast. That also might be part of someone's standard diet day to day as an athlete, and that's absolutely fine. But just to draw some illustrative examples, adding juice to a couple of meals, adding in some sports drink just as like a filler for hydration instead of water or an electrolyte beverage. Even things like gummy bears and graham crackers, like really not having balanced snacks and balanced meals, but really focusing on a disproportionate allocation of that meal or snack toward carbohydrate to enable us to show up puffy on race day and to build that glycogen storage, because it is going to benefit you going into the race. I typically will recommend that clients focus on a couple of A races a year where they're really endeavoring to have a carb loading protocol completed, because it's not the best thing for our bodies to really focus on that composition on a really frequent basis. That's pretty taxing for our systems. And so there's a strategic way to identify a couple of A races and to incorporate that to the full extent. There's a little bit of a different protocol in place for males versus female athletes. So for males, most of this is just due to absolute numbers, that males tend to be larger and they tend to have a higher intake of calories as related to their energy needs day to day. So 7 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates tends to be the recommended carb protocol for men, whereas for women, again, we're working off of generalities here, but for women, it tends to be 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for a carb loading protocol. Well, maybe I'll pause there in case there's any questions on carb loading protocol, but then I did want to also make a quick comment on post-workout recovery protocols with carb intake.
As far as the length of the carb loading protocol for that 7 to 10 or 10 to 12 grams per kilogram, how long is that protocol typically?
Yeah, so it does vary. My recommendation and the research recommendation does vary based upon what sort of like distance you're doing. So if you're going to do like a sprint triathlon, I actually really wouldn't recommend a formal carb protocol. If you're going to do a half Ironman, I would say 2 days. If you're doing an Ironman, I would say 3 days. And with some clients, or I would say with some endurance athletes, they may find that like if they are doing a half Ironman and it's a pretty steep departure maybe from what they're doing day to day, or just dietarily they want to build into this, even like a little bit of a modification where 3 days out from the race maybe they're doing 6 and then they're bumping up to 8 and then they're bumping up to 12 that final day prior, because it can be a little bit disruptive for some people to just have that much of a change in what their composition is looking like. Awesome. Okay, and then the final quick comment, and then I'll pass it back over to our moderators for the webinar for post-workout recovery protocols. So there actually is research that shows that we're able to maximize the repletion of our carbohydrate stores after exercise, specifically to promote recovery, and specifically considering when there's like 2-a-day workouts or 2-a-day sessions separated by about 4 hours or more, by focusing on co-ingesting glucose and fructose. So in the same way that while we're racing, co-ingesting glucose and fructose, most of the sports products out there, as Conrad described, are already sort of concocted to have that 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio. But there's actually research. There was a 2018 study that shows that that assessed runners, and it was actually showed that runners who co-ingested glucose and fructose were able to run for 30% longer during that second session, separated by 4 hours, versus, you know, the controls, which was glucose only or a fasted state. And I would never imagine a fasted state would lead to a benefit for that second stage. And it was also shown that there was a 20% improvement in recovery parameters, like creatine kinase and things like that, different markers. And so that's not super complicated necessarily. What I would just say is you can Google like a list of high fructose foods. You know, things like apples, grapes, honey are all really high fructose containing items. And so, you know, what that might look like is, you know, after a workout, you're having something, I'm thinking seasonally here, we're in the fall, right? Like an apple granola bowl with honey and some Greek yogurt. So you're getting some protein in there, maybe doubling up on granola, depending on how intense the workout was and how much of a session your later one looks like. And sort of experimenting that way to be able to really maximize recovery in that post-workout period. And as a parameter for folks to consider, you know, you should consider having something in the range of 1/2 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates in that post-workout period, to again replenish glycogen stores in preparation for the rest of your day, and then also specifically when you have a second session later in the afternoon, in preparation for that effort as well.
Awesome. And then can we break down maybe for, say, somebody who is 70 kilograms? I know you mentioned carbohydrate target in grams. Say they want a carbo load for 2 days going into a 70.3. Could we break it down into, you know, like what the range of recommendation would be on a calorie basis too?
Sure. So for a 70 kilogram human, the low end of the range on a carb loading day would be 500 grams of carbohydrate, which is 2,000 calories just of carbohydrate. And you know, depending on what else they're having in their day, again, some clients will, the target is like over 70% of your diet is comprised of carbs. Some individuals might go as steep as 90% of their calorie intake for those couple of days during carb loading is carbohydrates. Other people, you know, might not feel too good with that steep, again, of a disproportionate allocation toward carbs. So 500 grams for a 70 kilogram person is on the low end. And then on the upper end, for a 70-pound individual, we're doing, sorry, quick math in my head here, because I am using my my phone for this, would be, I think, 840 grams of carbohydrates. I'm seeing some nods, so some fast math maybe on the side here. Awesome.
Wow,
and so
that's
again,
impressive.
that's a pretty steep range though, right? Like 500 up to 840 grams. And so that is very much dependent on the person. In the same way, we don't want to trial carb loading strategies. Like I don't want us practicing and training, doing a ton of carb loading, because again, it is very taxing for our system. Not exactly the most healthful approach when we think about like longevity for humans. But really finding a sweet spot within that range, I think, can be super helpful. And so that's the calorie translation of that protocol to that 7 to 12 grams per kilogram for carb loading.
Got it. So low end, about 2,000 calories worth of carbs for somebody who's 70 kilograms. And then the higher end, 3,360 calories worth of carbs.
Yep.
Cool. Just like breaking it down like that sometimes, because a lot of athletes think in terms of calories. Most humans think in terms of calories. And it's good to contextualize it that way. But awesome. And then for a marathon, was it a 2-day? You think similar to a 70.3, a 2-day carb?
I would equate it in that way. The only nuance there would be, again, if someone was following like a diet where they were like training really low and then racing high. I know that that's there is some emerging theories and approaches where, maybe the day-to-day diet is really, really low carbohydrate, and then they funnel a lot of carbohydrates into the actual active window. Not a protocol that I typically recommend for the clients with whom I'm working, but if that's something that someone is doing, then I would actually recommend a 3-day period, because they're just typically not consuming sufficient carbohydrate in their day-to-day period. And so having that extra day helps to build that buffer back up.
Got it. Awesome. Anybody have any questions on, nutrition during race week or carbohydrate loading? Nope. Then let's move on to sodium, because sodium is an extremely important component of race day nutrition. Again, it's fluid, carbs, and sodium. And sodium is essential because, it's integral in nerve conduction, muscle contraction, and it's important in the absorption of fluid and nutrients. So, it has important functions in the body, and also it helps you absorb more carbs and fluid. And so when we think about sodium, you always have to think about it in terms of the fluid you're taking in, because we have to be careful, because if we drink too much fluid with no sodium, then you can easily overhydrate, experience hyponatremia, and that can be fatal. What ends up happening is your body basically starts sending the fluid to the cells to get it out of the blood, and the cells expand, and that's not good. If you ever have sort of puffy fingers when you're training or racing, that can be an example of you being actually overly hydrated. So the cells start storing more fluid, the cells themselves. Oftentimes it's seen as being like taking in too much sodium, but it's almost always the opposite of that. So, we need to dial in how much sodium we should take in per liter of fluid, and to know individually the perfect amount of sodium per liter, you do kind of need to know the composition of sodium in your sweat. Certain people are saltier sweaters. Some people don't have much sodium in their sweat at all. We typically see ranges in sweat wherein athletes lose 200 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter. And to an extent, we want to match that when we're drinking fluid. So, at minimum, we need to take in at least 500 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid. Most athletes are going to be around that, say, 800 to 1,200 milligrams of sodium lost in their sweat. And mixing your sports drink to that level is a good approach. For athletes who are losing, a lot of sodium per liter of sweat, we want to kind of push the limits, and the limits are around 1,500 milligrams of sodium per liter. Once you get above 1,500 milligrams of sodium per liter that you're taking in, it's just potentially a little bit too salty, and it's just not effective. Your body won't absorb it well. So if, we do sweat testing here at the lab. So you'd come in, we basically hook you up to we have a sweat testing machine, and we basically, you just sit there and we put these basically electrodes in your arm, and you start sweating underneath one of them. Then we collect the sweat in a little tube, and we know exactly how much sodium you're losing per liter, and that governs the plan. So again, athletes have ranged from just a few hundred milligrams all the way up to 2,000 milligrams per liter. Those athletes need to have dramatically different fluid intake targets when they're racing, and the concentration of sodium has to be different. And as an example, a scoop of Tailwind, so 100 calories of Tailwind has about 350 milligrams of sodium. That concentration is similar in Gatorade Endurance. Scratch has a little bit more sodium per calorie, basically. But we need to do the math, and you have to know what you're taking in. pH, so we partnered with Precision Hydration, and they make tablets, different tablets. They have pH 500, pH 1000, and pH 1500. And a serving of, the 1500 has 1500 milligrams of sodium. So the saltiest sweaters, that's what they should be using, or they should be targeting 1500 milligrams of sodium per liter when they're racing. And we also have to consider sweat rate in all of this. And that sort of loops back to, the fluid analysis. So your nutrition plan needs to be a function of, the duration of the race, or how many basically carbohydrates you're burning over the race, what your intensity factor is, how much sweat you're losing, and the sodium concentration of the sweat. If you know all of those things, then you should be able to dial in a good nutrition plan. We can get a good starting point for an athlete to test if we have all of that data. And then in training, we kind of test to see what works best, what products work best, etc. So again, talk to your coach about how to better dial in your race day nutrition. And obviously test it. We need to test it, all of this in training. And one thing I want to say is, when it comes to fluid loss, i.e. sweat rate, that will vary over a season. It'll depend on how fit you are. It'll depend the discipline you're engaging in. Most athletes will sweat most running and, say, really hot, humid conditions compared to if they were cycling in cool conditions. So we need to know that your sweat rate will vary across the year, depending on, temperature, conditions, and fitness, and acclimation to heat. The more acclimated you are, the more you'll sweat. But the concentration of sodium in your sweat won't change by much at all. So if you come and get a sweat test, it's a one and done thing. You don't have to keep testing that. And then, so I broke it down to these three things because they're the most important. You can argue that a little bit of potassium is good. You lose about like 200 milligrams of potassium when you sweat per liter, but so it's a tiny percentage compared to the sodium you're losing. That's why I'm really emphasizing sodium as the main electrolyte that we need to focus on. And I'm not talking about magnesium, calcium, or potassium, because you just lose fairly trace amounts. And the way to absorb the most amount of carbohydrates is to really keep it simple, just glucose and fructose. When we think about using real food, we have to be careful when we're racing, especially at a high intensity factor, because it's a little bit more work for your gut. I would say that in training, most rides, it's fine. I mean, experiment. It's fine having a Cliff Bar or, fig bars, whatever. We just need to be really careful using real food in racing. We just need to confirm that, our guts can handle it. But there's nothing wrong with real food so long as you test it. Does anybody have any questions about fluid, carbs, sodium, etc.?
I think you're planning on doing some case studies here in a second, Conrad, but yeah, I mean, one thing that I've seen athletes experience occasionally is having to do the math of all three of these things at once. And if you're putting together a race nutrition plan, for yourself, or supporting an athlete in doing that, what's the hierarchy? How do you go about putting together this entire plan? I've had athletes figure out their carb intake and fluid intake, and then they're but I'm 600 milligrams per hour of sodium, way too low. Where am I going to get that? Salt tabs. And then they realize that salt tabs are really not super high in sodium. So just wondering how you go about putting all of this together to ensure that all three of these main ingredients are all present.
That's a good question. And I think that step one is figuring out the fluid, because it's easy to put sodium and carbohydrates in fluid. And that's kind of step one. If an athlete is targeting a liter of fluid per hour, 32 ounces, and they're mixing and they just want to drink it in sports drink form, not concentrated, mixing it as per the recommendations on the powder or the product, they'll usually be around 300 calories in per liter, with about 1,000 milligrams of sodium. It kind of depends on if it's Scratch or Tailwind or Gatorade Endurance, but the ballpark, you're going to be around 1,000 milligrams of sodium, and kind of right around like 70, 75 grams of carbs. So having that as baseline is important. And sometimes that's all an athlete needs. Maybe they have an all liquid nutrition plan, and that's fine. The thing to add after that would be gels or chews. And you can do the math. Most gels and chews don't have much sodium, but there are gels that are starting to put sodium, the companies that are putting sodium in their gels. Is Alex G on here? What do you remember what that one was called?
I'm still on. Yeah. Huma Plus makes a chia gel that has 200 milligrams of sodium. It's the highest product I've seen on the market. There's another one called Crank. I think it's like a European based one that also has like about that range. But most of the like goos that you'll find on the market are more like 50 milligrams of sodium. So it's super low. And other ones are intentionally not containing sodium, like some of the precision gels, for example, don't have any sodium in them, because the expectation is that you're moderating and achieving that electrolyte sodium element through other means, through fluid intake. And so, so it's definitely something to pay attention to. And I think when you are also thinking about the hierarchy of consideration for like sports drink design, osmolality also comes into play with what is able to be tolerated by a lot of folks. So this isotonic range of 6 to 8% tends to be a pretty sweet spot. But there are individuals who are able to tolerate like 9 to 10% osmolality, which essentially just means more carbohydrate within a given amount of fluid. And that can be tested in training, that can be honed, and gut tolerance can be built so that you can, increasingly intake that. But that's also a consideration as you're thinking about sports nutrition design and product selection, even about, what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to like, if you find that you need more sodium, the pH salt capsules are good because they have 250 milligrams of sodium. You can pop them. You can even take one apart and dump it in the bottle, but that's going to have more than most salt capsules out there. I know like the salt stick, salt chews, they only have 50 milligrams of sodium. So, you have to eat 5 of those for 1 capsule of pH. And it's so definitely read the facts, the nutrition facts, and buy accordingly. But precision hydration is good because their stuff, they make it obvious like how much sodium is in their in the products, and you know that it's going to be a good balance of like potassium, magnesium, and sodium. Many companies they think, oh, well, the other electrolytes or all the electrolytes are equally important, but they're not. Sodium is so much more important because sodium exists extracellularly, so outside of the cells. It's in the plasma volume. It's what you sweat. You're sweating out that plasma volume. Pretty much most of the potassium in your body is intracellular. So you're not losing that potassium when you're sweating. You're losing a little bit, but not that much. So consider that, because when you start just adding a bunch of potassium and magnesium into your sports drinks, it increases the osmolality and you can't absorb it as well.
Another thing just like about the precision hydration tablets that you mentioned earlier, Conrad, not the pills, but the tablets. I've found that like, the flavor in those is significantly more mild. And so you can like put a tablet of that pH 1500 into a bottle that already has tailwind or like some other fuel source in it that might be low in sodium, and like that can like dramatically up the sodium content of that without like making it taste incredibly like sweet, salty, like overwhelming.
That's a good point. Yeah, easy on the palate, and you can, so the pH 1500, for example, one tablet is 750 milligrams of sodium. So you can dial it in also. You can break a tablet in half to make sure that you're getting in the sodium you need in a fairly easy way. You don't have to get a kitchen scale and get some sodium citrate from Amazon and do the math based on mass. But so, it's pretty good stuff. I just wanted to talk about just a few case studies so athletes can kind of contextualize how important dialing in your nutrition plan is. So Andy Stetzler, he did Ironman Chattanooga last month, and his PR before was, I think it was just around 11 hours, and he ended up going 9:01 at Chattanooga. And one of the main differences, apart from just being a little bit fitter, was he basically increased his carbohydrate intake by over 100%. So in prior Ironmans, he would take in like 50 to 60 grams of carbs, but he's putting out quite a lot, like mid to upper 200s on the bike and running very, very fast. So burning a lot of calories. So we increased his target to basically 100 grams plus on the bike. The goal was 100 to 120, and that gave him the energy to nail the run really well. So he PR'd by a couple of hours, and that was due in no small part to really obsessing over carbohydrate intake, fluid intake, and sodium intake in training, and to figure out what he could absorb, what he liked best, what product he liked best, and then crushing it. And then moving on to heavier sweaters. So Anthony and I did Kona last year, and both of us sweat a lot, like an outrageous amount. And like to the order of around 6 pounds per hour. So say 2.5 kilograms about, give or take, which is a lot. You can't replace all of that. But, to make up for that, we really focused on increasing our ability to absorb liquid. Like we explored the limits of our gut. Like how much fluid could we consume? And, oftentimes the athletes who are the heaviest sweaters can also consume a lot. So we targeted 1.5 to 2 liters per hour on the bike at Kona, and we're able to maintain that. And we had to be really careful to drink a lot of sodium with that. And I mean, the good thing is a bottle of Gatorade Endurance on the course at an Ironman, it has about 650 milligrams of sodium in, I forget if it's 22 or 24 ounces, but that's a fairly good concentration. So you can just keep drinking that. It shakes out to about 1,000 milligrams per liter, which is pretty good. So we really pushed the limits there. But I also want to give a nod to the lighter or lower power athletes. Oftentimes, smaller athletes just aren't going to be putting out as much power, so they're not combusting as many grams of carbohydrates. 100 grams might be overkill. A better target might be 60 grams of carbs per hour. Maybe they're only losing a pound per hour. So they can't be consuming 750 milliliters of fluid per hour. Maybe it's only 500 milliliters per hour. And again, sweat rate can vary depending on conditions. One athlete I coach is gearing up for an ultra marathon, and her sweat rate at about 9-minute pace in 80-degree weather that's fairly humid, her sweat rate was 2.5 to 3 pounds per hour. Right now, it's pretty cool where she's running. She's literally losing less than a pound per hour. So, and you want to test a couple times. You don't just want to test once, and like if there's that dramatic of a change. But clearly, she's an athlete who her sweat rate varies tremendously based on temperature. So we can't target even at 750 milliliters per hour when she's running her ultra. She has to 500 mil is max. So you need to test and adjust. And then I know athletes, we talked about precision hydration a little bit. Martin gels are extremely popular now in the marathon world, obviously. But yeah, these are some products to check out. I would say that, you know, these three are our favorite that we probably recommend the most to athletes. What are the other coaches? What do you often recommend to athletes, or what do you find is the most popular product among your athletes, successful athletes?
I guess I'll start. You know, a lot of athletes I work with use Martin and Tailwind. Obviously, Gatorade Endurance on course, but I will say precision hydration is definitely moving up the ranks right now. And Derek already mentioned this. Like, you can combine the products to accommodate exactly what you need, and that's the cool thing about precision hydration.
Yeah, agreed. Precision hydration, I think they're gaining market share. They're obviously massively popular among pro triathletes. They really penetrated the triathlon world, but there's a reason for it. It's their gels legitimately just go down way easier than all the others. Like, I don't ever want to have another goo in my life.
No.
It's just, they're solid. They're easy to consume, quality.
Mm-hmm.
They're a little bit less expensive than Martin, but I'm a fan of Martin also. But I know we posted on on an Instagram story. I think Mitch just sent over some questions, and one athlete. So we posted that we were having this webinar on Instagram and asked for some questions, and somebody asked ways to make Martin mixes more taste tolerable. Does anybody have any? So the thing is, Martin is very mild tasting, flavorless. Does anybody have any strategies?
I guess I can't really speak to that because I like the way it tastes. It's really, it's mild. It's kind of like Tailwind's pretty mild too. You know, and I never have thought about that as a bad thing. So yeah. I suppose you could add there's what's that? Is it Mayo? There's a drink.
Mio.
Yeah,
Mio. Yeah, maybe, but that
Mio.
has that could be something that would be worthwhile to test.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to go, is to get the Mio water enhancer drops, and you can, if you find that it's too mild, you can just add a couple of those to increase the flavor. If you like a heavier sweetness level.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I'd call out with Mio, I think it's a great recommendation, is that there are some of the Mio ones that have added vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's always super important for us to be conscious about the like overall load of additional supplemental vitamins we're taking in.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to be aware of that, if you're also taking like a multi or any other sort of supplement, that should be factored in. Just thinking about the volume of sports drink and things that folks are taking in on a pretty frequent basis during these training periods. And so, you know, a few extra drops of that, I think, is just something to be mindful of. But I do think that they taste great. And there also might be varieties that don't have the added vitamins, but I know some of the flavors do have a few of those layered in.
I don't know if there's food dye in it either, but if there is, that could be a problem for certain people as well. So it's worth looking into, especially if you had issues with food dye.
Mm-hmm.
I had an athlete recently that started adding Crystal Light packets to her Tailwind, and she like really enjoyed that. I didn't really look a whole lot into like what the content of Crystal Light packet is. I haven't had one of those in years, but yeah, she was like, the raspberry Tailwind with a raspberry lemonade Crystal Light packet is like on point. I personally, like, similar to Derek, I'm not a huge fan of like really strong flavored drinks. And so when I've done higher concentrations of like Tailwind specifically, they have the naked flavor, and I'll add like 200 calories of naked Tailwind and 200 calories of a flavored Tailwind to a bottle, like for a bit of a more concentrated like bottle on the bike. And that works really well for me. another like product that hasn't been mentioned that I've been like messing around with, and I know a couple of athletes out here in Boulder have been playing with recently, is like the SIS Beta Fuel like drinks and then gels as well. SIS was the first gel that I know had 160-ish calories in it, and now Morton has the 160 as well. And so I think that's a huge advantage in the endurance sport world, is that there are some like companies that are making these like higher, denser packages of fuel products. So yeah, the 160 milligram or 160 calorie gels, and then like 46 carbs, so like 180 calorie chews that SIS makes are both really great. And SIS also has like a 200 milligram caffeine beta fuel gel, which I mean, when it comes to caffeine content, I'm a fan of using caffeine at certain like specific points. I know that was on the outline as well, but yeah, 200 milligrams of caffeine is what I'm looking to take in. I don't want just 100 milligrams, and I also don't want to take like 2 caffeinated Morton gels at a certain point on the bike either. And so yeah, those SIS like 200 milligram caffeine beta fuel gels have been pretty clutch at a couple of points.
That's a good recommendation. I think Mitch uses the beta fuel. I think you mentioned that, but I haven't tried that yet. But yeah, to your point, I know PH, they came out with a 90 gram gel, 90 gram of carb gel. So that's 360 calories. And then they just came out with one that is, I want to say 300 grams of carbohydrates, a really big one, where essentially you'd be set for you'd be set for an Ironman bike lake if you just took it. It's a large sort of flow gel type thing. To simplify things, it's like $20 or something, but it's your Ironman nutrition.
One product that I've had success with is, and more for the price rather than anything special about it, is just powdered Gatorade. I get 10 pounds on Amazon for a ridiculous amount, and then I just weigh out how much I want as far as sugar and carbs, add a little bit more sodium if I need it, and just go for it. It's far cheaper than the other ones, but you do have to do a little bit of science and math to be able to get the precise measurements that you need. You do have to weigh it out scoop by scoop to make sure that you're hitting your sodium targets and your carb targets. That's a cheaper product that I like for quick afternoon workouts rather than key sessions.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I mean, you can always order a bag of sodium citrate from Amazon and supplement with it. It's just, what is it by mass? Like 25% of sodium citrate is sodium. So like 1,000 milligrams of sodium citrate would be 250 milligrams of sodium. Another question, ideal nutrition intake points. For example, should I take a little additional time in T2? So he's asking, when should I take in nutrition during a race? So on the bike, so no nutrition in transition. You want to get through transitions as quickly as possible, get on your bike as soon as possible, then start eating. Same in T2, get moving, and then you can start making progress, then take in nutrition on the fly. Definitely be strategic on the bike. Do not take in nutrition. Don't sit up when you're moving fast. You want to, if you're climbing like a hill and moving slowly, that's a good time to take in nutrition. Basically, anytime you don't need to be super aerodynamic and low is a good time to take in nutrition. And Tony asked, whoops, is there hold on.
Tony's question is there any marked difference in taking in carbs through bottle periodically or all at once per hour with a larger gel, and only using liquids for sodium?
Distributed evenly is best. There was, I forget who the researcher was in California who Marshall was friends with him. He did a lot of research into this and sort of figured out that, you know, more frequently in lower doses is better, from an absorption perspective and also the way that your body responds. That's a good question.
Then as far as only using liquids for sodium, I think for that question, I would just make sure that you're getting it from one source, or making sure that you're accurately figuring out how much sodium you're taking per hour, and making sure that if you're doing both sodium from your gels or your fuel as well as your hydration, that you're not either overdoing it or underdoing it. I think keeping it to, I know Precision Hydration recommends keeping it to one source. And then just sticking with that, just for easy calculations and easy tracking, over the course of an hour.
Yep. I know on the run, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to track exactly how much sodium you're taking in. One good way to consume sodium when you're running is the capsules. That's the one point. So it doesn't matter a whole lot if you're taking in the capsule and then kind of chasing it with liquid. Your body will still absorb it and receive the benefit. It is definitely easier in liquid form, I would argue, though. But check out the pH, the capsules. They're pretty solid. I think that covers best night before meal. I would say low residue, high carb pasta.
And I would also say, especially with the carb loading protocol method I was sharing earlier, that recommend actually having lunch be like a pretty large meal versus dinner. Not saying that dinner shouldn't also be like a pretty meaty size to make sure you're topping all of those stores off, but especially with, you know, an altered composition of your day-to-day and an increased calorie load in some cases, you'll find that having a little bit more of a front-loaded, you know, maybe 2 snacks earlier in the day between breakfast and lunch, and then still enjoying dinner, obviously, but making sure that you're not like at the end of the day and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to eat like this entire vat of spaghetti that the catered, you know, working triathlete team has put together for a meal before, you know, Ironman Chattanooga or something. You don't want to be in that position because you still have to digest that food, and wake up times for these races are early, and so you want to make sure that you can also you know, feasibly digest that, and you know, be prepared for the next morning. So I would make that note as well about thinking about lunch powerfully and not just that evening meal.
Great point. And then the last question we didn't answer yet. What does Derek Stone use on the bike? Joshua Venus asked that.
Well, everyone's so eager to know. I will, you know, start with, I do preload a lot with sodium the night before and the morning of the race. In the past, I've always started with Martin 360 mix and supplemented with gels for about the first 2 bottles, and then by the time I hit the first aid station in the 70.3, I dump a bottle and I grab the Gatorade Endurance. So I have a mix between Martin and Gatorade Endurance. However, I've been testing the PF&H, the Precision Hydration mixes. So we'll see what I do in Indian Wells, but it'll probably be a little bit of a change.
Well, I think someone was about to talk before, but somebody going to say something?
Yeah, I just had one question about fueling and running and the best way to like store fuel on the run. One thing I've struggled with is figuring out how to carry fuel to make sure that I get fuel in, because if I don't carry the fuel and I'm just running past, aid stations and just taking a few sips of cola, it's hard to track exactly how many calories I'm consuming and how many electrolytes I'm consuming. So what are some strategies for consuming fuel on the run?
This is the trickiest thing to address for sure. Everybody's a little bit different, and I'll talk about a trend first that a lot of athletes are sort of adopting, and that's running with a 500 ml soft flask. It's 500 ml, and you can start the run with that. You could put, a pH 500 or a pH 15 or basically one tablet. You could put 750 milligrams of sodium up to that in there, and then you can add a little bit of carb to it. And that could be a good approach. For Ironman races, you could fill that up. Certain athletes, all they use is the 500 ml soft flask, and they just keep filling it up, and they'll do the math there. If you fill that up with Gatorade Endurance, you should get around, what is that, like 130 calories in there with, a decent amount of sodium. So that is an approach. Another approach is just using gels, pH capsules, so 250 milligram sodium capsules. For athletes who need to be really precise, this is a pretty good approach, where you take a gel every 20-25 minutes, and then you drink the water at the aid station, and every 25 minutes or so you take one of those 250 milligram sodium capsules. Another approach is listen to your body, but be disciplined, and at every single aid station drink 1 to 2 cups of Gatorade Endurance, or just drink as much as you possibly can at each aid station, up to 2 to 3 cups. It's pretty okay to assume that each cup of Gatorade Endurance is about 20 to 25 calories. So if you do the math that way, you're pretty much guaranteed to be getting in a good ratio of carbs to fluid to sodium. That's the approach I like. It's, at every aid station at the beginning, it's about 2 cups of Gatorade Endurance. But at a certain point, you have to learn to listen to your body, know what works for you. You get a sense of how much Gatorade Endurance you're taking in, how much more you could be taking in, and you just keep taking in as much as you can. And, you can also supplement with a caffeinated Martin at the aid stations. So I would say those are the 3 main approaches. But you should always target at least 60 grams of carbs, even when you're running per hour. Again, most athletes could probably tolerate a little bit more. That's a good question. Anybody have any other questions or comments? I think we covered most of these common mistakes. Just to wrap things up. One thing that we maybe did not cover was basically the opposite of what we're talking about. And maybe we should de-emphasize consuming a bunch of sugar if you're a low volume athlete. You don't need to be, if you're doing a 45-minute run and that's your only workout of the day, you don't need to be slamming 3 gels. You probably don't need to be taking in anything. But certainly athletes who are bigger volume athletes, or if you're working out 2 times or 3 times in a day, then it can make sense taking in gels and other nutrition during your sessions that are even under 90 minutes. But otherwise, unless you're going 90 minutes, there isn't a huge need to, take in nutrition during it. A little bit is fine, some water, whatever, sports drink, etc.
One other thing that I'd mention that I have heard happen for some athletes when they start to realize how much, or just the importance of taking in this amount of carbohydrates, this amount of fluid and sodium, they'll I've had a couple of athletes want to just bring more than enough, or have way more than enough on the bike. And I tend to want to stay away from that, not having just a a bunch of extra gels in their bento box or something like that, because it a lot of times results in you finish the bike and you're not really sure if you executed your plan to like the precision that you really needed. You're like, oh, there's like, yeah, 3 or 4 gels left in there, or like, I don't really remember if I grabbed that last bottle or not. And then you're just kind of going into the run without knowing exactly where you're at. I was made to think about this when somebody asked that question about, do you take nutrition in T2? Like, I agree with you, Conrad. Like, the answer is no. But if you get to T2 and you realize that there is still a gel in your bento box and that was part of your plan, then you need to take that gel, or like carry it out of transition with you and take it as soon as you start the run. So that's how I like to think about it, is you should have what you need on the bike and nothing more. And also you should know if you launch a bottle or if something goes wrong with your nutrition plan on the bike, you should know exactly what is in a bottle of Gatorade Endurance, and you should know exactly like what you can get from an aid station and what that like contingency plan is if something is to go awry.
Yeah, that's a good point. The only thing I would add to that is sometimes it's not a bad idea to have an extra gel or two in case you do launch nutrition and you need access to it. But that's
knowing how much extra you have, and not like I have a bunch of extra just in case.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I know that I launched a concentrated bottle when I was doing an Ironman one year, but I had, or 70.3, but then I had an extra few gels. I knew exactly how many extra gels I had. So, but that's a good point. Yeah. You don't just want to have a buffet and not keep track of what you're doing. At any given point, I always tell athletes, at any given point in an Ironman, you should be able to say how many calories you consumed, how much fluid you've consumed. Like if you asked me 3.5 hours into the bike leg at Kona, I could have told you exactly. And that's the level of detail that you kind of need, especially for hot races or when there's no room for error. You have to pay attention to all this. And then maybe the last one, John Grant asked, how important is caffeine intake in this discussion, training versus racing? Caffeine is really important. It's an ergogenic aid. The potential performance benefit is massive. I think to the order of multiple percentage points. And as a rule, 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram is kind of the sweet spot there. So that's a lot. I know Derek Owens earlier, you mentioned that you like 200 milligrams of caffeine sort of boluses. And I think that's right. It's going to help you, and everybody's different. You need to practice. For a number of athletes, the protocol is, right before, so 30 minutes before the swim, take in 100 milligrams or so, do the swim. And then on the bike, it's reasonable to take in kind of like you mentioned, Derek. I like that 200 milligrams at once about halfway through the bike, because that's when you start losing focus, your neck is starting to hurt and your power is going down. But if you upcharge with a 200 milligram caffeine gel, or whatever the method, you're going to feel better. It's going to kind of push you through. And one thing I would say, you test in training, but you can take in a lot of caffeine when you're exercising. The diuretic effect is mitigated if you're moving your body. If you're just laying around consuming a bunch of caffeine, it has a substantial diuretic effect and you're going to be peeing a lot, but that doesn't happen when you exercise. That's what the studies show.
And just something worth mentioning when it comes to taking in caffeine while training is like not doing it to the extent that it impacts your sleep and therefore your recovery. So like taking a little bit of caffeine before an afternoon workout like might not be a terrible thing, but if you notice it impacting your ability to go to bed at a normal time, then like I would cut that out and just like do the workout without the caffeine.
Right. That's a good point. Don't want to sacrifice sleep. So that's where those evening workouts, it can be tough. So just be careful taking caffeine in training before you go to bed. But sometimes it helps you get out and get on the trainer bright and early in the morning, or get to the pool. Some caffeine that can help. All right. Well, I know we're an hour 17 in, so I think that that pretty much covers it. Any closing thoughts or comments from anybody? Nope. Well, thanks for joining, and I will post this webinar on our webinars page so that you can refer back to it and watch it again if you so choose. But good seeing everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.